Hey folks, my name is Tony Mo. I'm a newer GM. At this point, I've got about a year's worth of weekly sessions under my belt. I've been playing a handful of different systems over the last 3 years, on and off, and I like to create discussion, conversation around the things I learn as a GM, and occasionally I like to dive into the realm, the world of guides, creating very specific topical-based discussions on how to do things as a GM, and hopefully we can all share our own experiences and just learn from it. So today I wanted to focus on combat encounter design. This is very much like a part 2 to my first video that I did, which was all about using skill checks in narrative encounters. Today we're going to talk about using skill checks to build interesting tension-filled combat encounters that hopefully tie your narrative to the combat and just all in all bring your combat encounters to life in a way that they might not have been otherwise. I really think the moment you stop thinking about just how you could move like the bad guy pieces on the battle map to try and defeat your player character pieces, and think about how you can maybe just make the whole thing have a little bit more pizzazz, a little bit more cinematic oomph to it, while also making it more challenging and more tense, you start to get some pretty cool combat encounters, and I think there's a lot to learn from doing combat encounter design like this. It's something I started to dabble in after watching what the Dimension 20 crew did. This is something that is very common in the designs that they run throughout many of the different seasons of the show, and I decided I'd have my own hand at it and start doing this in my Cyberpunk Red campaign about 4 months ago now, and I have not looked back since. I always try to find some way to do some sort of a skill-based check, or ask myself how I can create some sort of a recurring event that is tied to the NPCs, or something that is happening during the course of this combat, and it almost always makes for more interesting encounters. So let's go ahead and dive into a encounter I ran about 2.5 months ago now for my players in our Cyberpunk Red campaign. This was very much one of the climactic moments in the particular narrative beat that they were on. They are boarding this Hammerhead train as a part of a heist job to destroy this cloning data that Arasaka is trying to sneak into Night City. They need to destroy the data, stop the train before it reaches NC as well, and they decide they're going to do that by getting on top of the train and attempting to get into a sort of, security hatch that is located on the top of the train, an emergency escape hatch, if you will, for the train. And so I had a little bit of time in advance, I had about a week actually, to think about what I might want to happen in terms of combat here. There was also some narrative encounter stuff I did as they were getting to the train, but once the players were on the train, I knew I wanted them to actually have a combat moment on top of this speeding train, because come on, number one, that just sounds fucking cool. And then I started asking myself, okay, how can we make that even more interesting? So let's walk our way through it. First and foremost, I don't think I said any of those words right. The players are going to have to try to get through this emergency hatch. They might know it's there, but they still have to get through it. And it's not just lock and key or just hack your way through it. It is a hard, thick, armor-plated hatch aboard this massive armored Militech train, right? And so they did have explosives with them for the job. That was something they considered. And they also have a tech who could probably find a way to, precision cut through this armor plating. And so they did like some rolls beforehand. I was like, okay, you can find a way as a tech to definitely cut through these hatches. You also have the explosives. And so when the time came and it was like, okay, how are we going to do this? I decided to throw a mechanic at them. This is something that I sort of roughed up going into this encounter, and then was able to give them the final execution of how it was going to work when the time came. And so I told them, you can set explosives on this hatch. To do that, though, it's going to take you 3 rounds. So somebody's going to have to be actively, packing the explosives appropriately to blow this hatch without just, not blowing the hatch, or maybe doing something worse if you use too much. And that's going to take 3 rounds. Now, if you do that, you're going to give away your position to anyone inside of the train, potentially set off security alarms that you're not aware of. Who knows what bad things might await you if you just go boom loud through this thing. The other option then was, okay, your tech can cut through the hatch. If they're going to do that, though, it's going to take longer. It's going to take 5 rounds. But you will have the element of surprise once you board the train. So I kept it simple, but I gave them some consequences for the actions that they were about to choose. They ended up going with cutting the hatch. Now, Here is one failing to this combat encounter design, and something maybe you can learn from when you design your own encounters like this. It was something I had considered, but in the moment, I didn't consider it enough. I had a player for 5 rounds sitting on a cargo hatch cutting it. The idea, knowing that my players don't necessarily mind situations like that if there's other things that they can do, was that the players who weren't cutting the hatch were going to have to defend this player. I also allowed that player to take 2 attack actions since they couldn't move. But just the way the top of the train was designed, with some of these like power unit boxes that were sticking out for cover and like some vent units sticking out for cover, it was difficult for them to ever be able to take a shot. Plus, the only gun they had at this point in time was like a shotgun they were using. So their range wasn't great. They had a pistol, I think, and their slug shotgun. They did eventually get to take a few shots. Here's what I would have done. I would have told the tech, if, you know, beforehand, if you want something to cut this train, if you roll well enough, you can make a device that can cut through the train without you being there, right? Like, very much like the drill in Payday, for example, where the players can just deploy this thing, and if it takes damage, it will need to be restarted or something like that, right? Even give it its own SDP, so potentially the AI could entirely destroy it, and then they'd have to blow their way through. Just something to consider for the future. But they take the stealth approach. The tech decides to get on this thing and start cutting it. And it's at that point that, you know, I roll in the bad guys. They already knew they were going to combat, considering I told them something was going to take 5 rounds. But I roll in the combat. An Aerodyne swoops in that is flown by the key baddies in this portion of the narrative story beat, which is Borg Smasher. And an individual he's working with in Arasaka called the Talon. She's this, you know, veteran solo working for Arasaka. They fly in, they drop a bunch of troops off out of this Aerodyne, and now they've got a combat encounter happening on top of the train. And so their main concern right off the rip is already, we can't let anything happen to kick our ignition here, because if he takes damage, I told him that was going to add time. So if he takes damage and gets, you know, paused and has to restart whatever he is doing, it's going to add potentially additional rounds to the timer for cutting that hatch. So they were already like, we need to defend him. Let's make sure that happens. I let it go for about 2 rounds before I had the Aerodyne that was flown by the Talon and Smasher fly back around. Talon in the you know, the pilot's seat. Smasher hanging out of the side of the Aerodyne with his big, you know, machine gun. And this is when I introduced the real meat and potatoes mechanic of this combat encounter. Again, I wanted something that was going to really drive up the tension. If you are on top of a train that's going like, you know, 150 plus miles an hour, engaged in combat while your buddy tries to cut through a hatch, what's like the worst possible thing that could happen apart from you just being like exploded and killed? Oh, well, you know, Borg Smasher and an Aerodyne can fly by and literally do like flybys with his machine gun on you and force you to make evasion checks at the top of every single round to see if you take additional damage. And so that's exactly what I did. I told the players, okay, this is what's going to happen. Once we get to the top of a new round, I'm going to go ahead and you know, have Smasher come in. They're going to do a flyby. You all need to make a evasion check with a difficulty value of 17. If you beat that, you take no damage. You don't go prone. You dodge out of the way of the incoming fire. If you don't beat that, we're going to go ahead and roll 4d6 damage, which is just standard shoulder arms rifle damage in Cyberpunk Red. And whatever that is, all of you who failed that will take that. If you roll lower than a 10, you will get knocked prone on top of taking damage, and you'll have to use an action to get up. Now, of course, for the tech, if they took damage, they'd also add time potentially, depending on how much they took to the round. So immediately 2 rounds in, they are overwhelmed with tension. And I remember one of the players being like, okay, I'm scared. And I was like, I've done my job. At the end of the day, the encounter itself wasn't like so difficult that they could not beat it. I didn't actually make this like a bloody encounter, right? I guess is what I'd call it, where I was going to like beat them to a pulp and get them to the very brink of their HP pool. I just wanted it to be tension filled. I wanted it to be like, holy shit, this is a train heist. This is wild. I honestly probably could have took it a little bit further on them. There's some things I did with the way I dropped off units on the train that I wasn't a huge fan of, but nonetheless, this was the core loop. This is what we designed. It's really as simple as that. Ask yourself, like, what's already happening in this combat encounter? Any combat encounter you have in your notebook right now that you're about to run, and if it doesn't have these sorts of elements, it's just like bad guys show up. Maybe it's like there's reinforcements type thing, which is fine too. But maybe it's just as simple as bad guys on board fight people, right? I think when you're a newer GM especially, that's where you're at, and that's totally understandable. You got enough to worry about. You're like trying to make sure that you make, you get the right stat blocks, or you make NPCs that don't just one-shot murder your players. What's the CR for these monsters? It says it's 1, but I don't know. That's a lot of damage. It's probably there's a lot to be stressed about. I totally get it, right? But once you get to past that point and you can comfortably design a basic encounter where your players almost always succeed, this is a great next step, I think, apart from like trying to push those NPCs to just stretch and see how much damage you can do to your players before they like succeed or die. I think adding mechanics to the encounter is honestly the next step I would recommend a newer GM takes. It's going to let you think about combat encounters in a totally different way. And more importantly, like I said, it lets you bring some of that narrative directly into the combat encounter. So in this case, I've got these NPCs, rather than just throwing them on the battle map and being like, hey, fight this guy, who they already know is like a monster. Borg Smasher's borged out of his mind in my universe. They're working with real Atom Smasher. Borg Smasher is a cloned by Arasaka just to be like a machine of death, okay? So I didn't want to just like have them fight this guy directly. I wanted there to be something else. And that's when I was like, okay, they're in the Aerodyne, they're going to drop bags off, they're going to do these flybys. And I think you can really easily adapt, any encounter you have with that sort of mechanic, right? Ask yourself what sort of skill checks you might want the players to make. And sometimes it's just as simple as one thing. That's it. Hey, we're going to roll evasion. You might want to do something where the players can attempt to engage with this thing to gain advantage. And I did do something like that in this particular encounter. We won't get too deep into it, but the general idea is some NPCs were also helping them. If the NPCs rolled a shoulder arms check really well, they'd be able to put some suppressive fire on the Aerodyne as it made its flyby, and that would give the players advantage on their evasion rolls. The idea being that Borg Smasher up there would be a little less accurate considering he's taking oppressive gunfire from a unit on the ground in a car. So why don't we go ahead and quickly adapt a D&D style encounter? Maybe that'll help give you guys another example. This is kind of one that was bouncing around in my head that I just find actually kind of comical. We'll keep it very classic D&D, okay? You're I guess having a goblin in your party as a player is probably not that classic D&D, but hear me out on this, okay? Your group of PCs, including one of the player characters who's a goblin named Dave, is going to assault this goblin fortress where his evil brother Steve has been residing. Okay, Steve killed Dave and Jerry's brother, or Dave's brother Jerry, and Dave's like, man, Steve, he's a real piece of shit, man. I gotta avenge Jerry's death. Jerry was a good guy. He just wanted to be like one of the best goblin bakers you ever seen. You should have tasted his bumbleberry pie. And so they roll up and they're like, Steve, we're gonna fuck you up. And they get inside the Goblin Fortress. And Goblin Fortress, maybe kind of a compact area. Maybe it's got like a second floor in the back, that overlooks where there's some goblin archers. But then you got all these goblin fighters down low, and the PCs roll into combat. So we've got a basic encounter right there already. Okay, we can maybe have some rangers up top. Oh, that's a little bit of variety to it. The players are moving around some bits of cover, barrels and boxes and storage, maybe some tents down in the bottom area. Maybe there's areas where they can climb up on ladders to get some high ground advantage, but they're just in a fight. How do we spice this up a little bit? What if Dave's brother Steve comes out and is just like, I'm going to fucking kill you like I killed Jerry, you goblin cowards. We're evil. Let's go. And he is like a crew that are on this homemade goblin slingshot, right? And there's 3 of them. It's Steve and 2 of his cronies. And they're going to start launching pouches of rocks at the players. And so as the players roll into combat, we lay out 4 area of effect markers on the battle map. And we tell the players, this is D1, this is D2, this is D3, and this is D4. If you are in this area when Steve and his gaggle of goblins on this giant slingshot roll up in the initiative order, they're going to roll a 1d4. Whatever number it lands on, that's where they shoot the rocks. If you're in that area, you've got to make a dodge check with, with a DC of whatever. You'd have to adapt this to whatever works best for your players. And if you fail that, you take, 1d4 damage. Let's say it's a bunch of level 1 adventurers. You don't want to have them take too much damage. You probably want to set the difficulty challenge, the challenge rating here, the DC, pretty low so it's doable for anybody who should have good acrobatics. Maybe the tanky paladin takes some damage. But now you've created these hot spots on the map. And I think more importantly, you could take that one step further and make sure you position those in areas where you want there to be like a high risk, high reward element. For example, if there's a really good flanking route that runs up to Steve himself, where, Dave as the player character might try to rush Steve down and like avenge, Jerry's death. You want to make that like a difficult area to move through. Put one of those markers there. Put, like the D3 there and say, you can totally take that flanking opportunity. It's got all this good cover, keeping you protected from the inside. Archers can't even see you, but hey, guess what? They could launch the slingshot there on their turn. Totally random. It's out of my hands. I like to make encounters. I like to make elements in my encounters that feel dangerous, that sometimes are really dangerous, that also remove I take my hands away from it. It's the dice. I had nothing to do with it. I think it's one of the most gratifying things you can do for as a GM and for your players is to develop something that can literally be up to the dice roll. You go through all the trouble of making it work and making sure the averages are like right on dice rolls so you don't just absolutely murder your players with it. And then you say, your fate is in the hands of the dice. Let's roll a 1d4. Oh, sorry, Dave. You better go ahead and roll dodge for me. It looks like your brother Steve there has really got it out for you. He launches some rocks your way. And I think once we can start coming up with those ideas, that really the more challenging part is just refining them. I think anybody who stops to think like we're trying to think here for just even half an hour is going to have a ton of great ideas potentially. But really it's then like, okay, what are the averages for the dice rolls? What are my players' health values at? How much damage would I want this to roll? Do I want it to also roll to hit? Do I want to have the 1d4 be an area? But then do I also want to say, okay, we're going to see if they even hit? So they're going to roll against your AC. Then you got to do the averages for that to make sure that they don't constantly crush your players. At the end of the day, setting difficulty on things like rolls is really considering the skill of your players, the averages they can roll, and the averages that the thing they're going up against might roll, and deciding, like, how challenging do you want to make it? How far above the average do you want to set it, or below the average do you want to set it? At least that's the way I do it in Cyberpunk, and that helps me kind of wrap my head around this sort of stuff to make sure I don't crush the players or give them something that's just way too easy. But hopefully that was a good example for you on top of the Cyberpunk Red encounter we talked about. Again, you can apply this stuff to any similar system, 5e, Pathfinder. If combat functions something like it does in these systems, and skill checks can readily be plugged into your combat encounters. Players might be using, perception stuff during combat. It's not really that big of a deal to go one step further and be like, hey, you're making these rolls every round. And you can take this well beyond, like the idea of somebody shooting the players with something every round. You can have environmental hazards that work this way. People already like to do some of this stuff with like difficult terrain. You could say the terrain gets increasingly more difficult because maybe the players are on the side of a sinking ship, and as the ship goes up more and more, each round they've got to make a higher difficulty check to stay on the ship. It could be on the side of a mountain and like there's an avalanche. Like, you can get wild with this. You just got to do a little bit of testing and then throw it at your players, see what happens, and learn from your mistakes and learn from your experiences. I absolutely adore designing combat encounters now. When I first started playing, it was kind of more of a just like, okay, I make my own battle maps for Cyberpunk. Let's make a battle map that's based in this environment. And then I would just stress about like, do I have enough enemies? Are they strong enough? Eventually I got good at that, but now being able to do this makes designing combat encounters a joy. It's like a new experience every time of like, okay, what am I going to do for this one? And sometimes I'll just have ideas on a whim where I'm like, hey, if the players ever ran into this thing or this sort of thing, here's what we might be able to do. And I've had entire combat encounters birthed from first thinking about the sort of skill checks I might have the players make, or the sort of narrative set pieces I might design, and then how do I design mechanics around that? Spend some time with this sort of thing, run through some encounters in your own time, just take some dice and make some rolls and, make some example encounters if you're in a digital format and roll 20 or Foundry or whatever you're doing, or in physical, and just have fun with it. I think that's really the way you're going to learn and start to discover some pretty fucking cool ideas. That's it for me though, folks. Thanks so much for hanging around. If you haven't checked out my video on implementing skill checks into narrative encounters to also pep them up a little bit, I strongly recommend you check that out. It'll be in the annotate. It'll be everywhere. Just, click the buttons that tell you to watch this and you'll find it. If you'd like to check out my campaign diaries, that's also a thing that's got a playlist. We're going to be introducing player character diaries next week, as I am jumping into my buddy Mike, who plays in my Cyberpunk Red campaigns, Pathfinder campaign that is going to take place in Exandria in Matt Mercer's world with a little bit of his own homebrew. And I'm very excited for that. So get to meet my character next week, and we'll talk about our first session. Take care of yourselves out there, folks. Have fun. That's what GMing is supposed to be about. If you got a great group of players who are also there to have fun, you can make mistakes, and you can all laugh about it and learn from it. And as a whole, your tabletop party can just grow together and have more enjoyable tabletop experiences as time goes on. So be awesome to one another. I'll see you around.